Echoes of Route 66. The bus station in Ephraimville was in terrible shape. It was an old building that matched the small, dusty, and boring town around it. Margaret checked the time. It read 5 minutes before 2, which gave her plenty of time. She stepped out of the stifling July heat, which was record-breaking for this year, into the cool interior of the station. Air conditioning was a pipe dream in a place like this. The thick, gray concrete walls and the cold, unpolished floor offered some relief. There was a window high up on the wall that let in sunlight only in the early morning, when the light was gentle. The station was big enough, but it felt empty and depressing. There were 4 benches in the middle of the room. They were scratched and faded. They were in 2 rows. Another lonely bench, its paint peeling, stood alone by the huge window that looked out over the cracked asphalt outside. Near the entrance door, which looked out onto the boarding area, there was a dented trash can. In the corner by the ticket counter, there was a faded schedule board on the wall. It was probably there since the station first opened decades ago. Behind the benches, across from the counter, a narrow door led to a small restroom with a stained toilet, a dirty sink, and a smudged mirror. This place wasn't designed for people to stay long. It was a short stop between home and the next stop on the road. You could come in, buy a ticket, wait for your bus, get on the bus, and get off. That's why the benches were so hard. There was no comfort here, just a place to sit while you counted down the minutes until you could leave. Margaret stepped inside and looked around the room. On the benches, waiting for their ride, sat a plump, friendly-looking woman, maybe 35, dressed in a bright green and pink sundress that didn't fit in with the dull surroundings, and a man in a wrinkled business suit, complete with a tie and a very outdated briefcase that made him look like a small-town accountant. Over by the restroom door, old Betty, the local janitor with her gray hair tied back, was wringing out a soggy rag in a bucket of murky grayish water, preparing to smear the light summer dust across the concrete floor in a half-hearted attempt at cleaning. Everything was exactly as it always was, dull, predictable, and unchanging. Margaret made the trip to Groverton, the neighboring county seat, twice a week. For 3 years, she had been going there on Tuesdays and Saturdays, and it was always the same. A changing group of passengers, sometimes a few, sometimes just 1 or 2, passed through. Betty either scrubbed down the station with her old mop or just started to wave it around lazily. Outside, the weather changed with the seasons. In the winter, snow piled up, and in the summer, the weather was so hot that the ground was baked. But the bus station stayed the same. It was the dullest, most depressing place imaginable. A purgatory that was not so subtly called a waiting room. She couldn't wait to leave and forget it. There were 2 buses to Groverton each day, one at 2:30 in the afternoon and another at 5 p.m. Margaret almost always took the one that left at lunchtime. She had started going to it regularly over time. She was going to see her older sister, Mary Ann, who lived alone in a small house on the edge of Groverton. Mary Ann had been struggling with Parkinson's disease for years, and it was getting worse. No matter how much Margaret begged, Mary Ann refused to move in with her. Their arguments about it always ended in tears. "I'm tired of having to go out to see you," she'd shout. "Then don't bother. I'll get by just fine," Mary Ann would respond angrily. "Fine, I won't come anymore," Margaret would respond. "Good, get lost, don't ever come back," came the reply. But sure enough, 3 days later, Margaret would be back on that bus to Groverton. The sisters would act like they hadn't argued, sipping tea in tense silence until the next fight. You could understand Margaret's point of view. Her sister's refusal was frustrating, and the constant trips had taken a toll on her. The sight of that rundown bus station, the sad benches, Betty's constant mopping, and the old, shaky Greyhound bus on Route 66 for an hour and a half was enough to make her wish the whole thing would just crash and burn. Margaret walked to the ticket counter and nodded quickly to the cashier. Today it was Tony, a loud, friendly woman with a good sense of humor and a talent for remembering people's faces. Tony noticed Margaret and didn't even ask. She punched a few keys, printed the ticket, and slid it through the scratched plastic window with a smile. "Here's your seat 4, right behind the driver, same as always," she said cheerfully. "Thanks, Tony," Margaret replied, sliding her pre-counted cash across the counter from her worn leather wallet. "My favorite spot. It's a scorcher out there today, though." "Good thing there's barely any wind," Tony added, leaning forward a bit. "It must be brutal riding in this heat, huh? I don't go farther than my mother-in-law's place on Old Mill Road. It's too much of a hassle." "You're not kidding," Margaret said, already starting to daydream. "This heat could knock me flat with a stroke at 59, especially with this weird weather we're having. I'll ask Nick, your driver, to open all the vents and windows. Safe travels," Tony promised with a wink. "A good breeze will make it bearable for you." "Oh, thanks, you're a lifesaver," Margaret said, smiling, though she was tired. She put the ticket in her purse. "Not many folks today again," Tony said in a slow, relaxed voice. Then she lowered her voice to a quiet, gossipy tone. "Those two over there might be on your bus. That chubby lady, I swear I've seen her around town somewhere, maybe at the diner. And that young guy. Look at him, all dressed up in a suit in this heat. He must be from out of town. We don't get fancy types like that here. Except maybe the DA or that stuck-up water department boss. Oh, and there's a little girl too," she added casually. Right then, the old rotary phone on Tony's desk let out a shrill, grating ring that cut through the quiet. She grabbed the phone and started talking loudly, her voice echoing off the concrete walls. Margaret figured their little chat was done and stepped back from the window. What little girl was she talking about? Sure enough, over on the bench by the big window sat a girl, maybe 10 years old, skinny as a rail, wearing a bright pink dress with matching pink socks and sandals. Her long golden blonde hair spilled over her shoulders, framing a delicate, sad little face that looked almost too perfect. In her small hands, she held a huge, multicolored plastic beach ball, the kind you'd see at a summer picnic. "Huh, where'd she pop up from?" Margaret thought, frowning slightly. "I didn't notice her when I walked in. Something that colorful in this gray place would have caught my attention right away." The beach ball made her think of something from her childhood, but she couldn't remember what. Could she be with the plump woman sitting nearby? They didn't seem to even glance at each other, though. Or maybe with the guy in the suit. Or maybe she was with the girl and her father or uncle. But he was so lost in his own thoughts that he didn't notice her. "Oh, never mind," Margaret decided with a casual shrug. She had never had children herself. After an abortion at 19, the doctors had been blunt. "You can't have kids," they had said. She glanced at her watch. It was almost time to leave. Through the window, she saw the familiar, disliked Greyhound pull up to the boarding area, its engine rumbling like an old beast. Nick, the driver, strode in through the door, head down, not bothering to look around. He made a beeline for Tony to grab his route papers. They started talking, their voices barely heard over the background noise of the station. The loudspeaker crackled to life. "Boarding for the route now starting at platform 1, it announced. Margaret went to the exit, looking back quickly. The plump woman was up too, hurrying to keep pace behind her. The man was standing up too, trying to button his jacket. He raised his middle finger high in the air. Margaret's eyes widened and her face went pale, but she kept going. She forcefully opened the door and stepped back into the stifling July heat. Margaret took a couple of steps forward on instinct, then froze. Her mind tried to catch up. The bus had left the boarding area. "Where's the bus?" the man asked in a low voice. He was puzzled. He caught up to her side. "It was right here a second ago, I swear!" The plump woman insisted, her voice rising with confusion. I saw it pull in, and the driver went straight to the ticket booth." They both looked at Margaret as if to say something. She nodded slowly. "I saw it too," she confirmed. But the boarding area stretched out empty before them, not a tire mark or puff of exhaust in sight. They stood there, looking around in every direction, shifting their weight from foot to foot. The place felt empty and abandoned, like an old ghost town. "They wouldn't just leave without us," Margaret said. Her voice sounded tight and forced, mostly to break the eerie silence. "We need to check with Tony." They shuffled back inside, the heat clinging to their clothes. Margaret marched straight to the ticket window and leaned in. Nothing. On the counter was a few coins, a chewed-up pen, an open logbook with curling pages, and some crumpled papers. But there was no Tony, no driver, and no sign of life. "Did they go into the restroom or something?" Margaret muttered under her breath. She looked around the room. She thought about asking Betty, but the old janitor was nowhere to be seen. Next to the bucket, a mop lay on the floor. Its rag was still wrapped around the handle, and a small puddle of dirty water was seeping out from under it. "Maybe they're in the restroom," Margaret said. Her voice was shaking as she moved closer to the door, feeling nervous. She felt uneasy, as if something was about to happen that she didn't want. Her two companions started to follow her, but the man hesitated. His face went red with embarrassment, and he took a step back towards the window instead. Margaret grabbed the bathroom door handle and pulled it open. If someone was inside, it would be locked with the latch, and she would just wait for Tony or Nick to come out. But the door swung wide, and there was a strange, thick darkness that seemed to swallow the light. She was startled and fumbled along the wall for the light switch. A dim light bulb flickered on overhead, lighting up the small space with its stained toilet, chipped sink, and cracked mirror. It was empty. "Is nobody in there?" the woman asked. Her voice trembled slightly from behind. "Nobody," Margaret confirmed slowly, her mind reeling with confusion. She turned back to the waiting area. The man in the suit, his briefcase still in hand, stood and gazed out the window, frowning thoughtfully. Next to him on the bench sat the little girl. "Wait, what? With a rabbit now?" She had been holding a beach ball, Margaret remembered. She had a similar one as a child. It was light, bouncy, and full of summer joy. But there was no mistaking it now. The blonde girl in the pink dress and red sandals held a big, soft lavender rabbit in her chest, her fingers gently running through its fur. "What's wrong? Where are your parents? Who are you with?" Margaret asked. Her voice was soft, but sounded worried. The girl pressed her face into the rabbit's soft fur and sobbed even louder, more pitifully, the sound barely reaching anyone in the empty station. Margaret looked at the man and the plump woman standing nearby, feeling helpless. They stood a few steps away, listening closely to the conversation. Hey, Margaret said gently, reaching out to gently touch the girl's shoulder with her fingertips. "Don't cry, sweetie. Tell me what's wrong." For a few tense seconds, the girl remained silent. Her shoulders trembled, and she mumbled into the rabbit. Her voice sounded quiet and small. "I feel sorry, so sorry," she said. Her voice was as lovely as her delicate features, pure and clear despite the tears. Margaret, feeling even more upset, knelt down and asked, Sorry for what, honey? She gently stroked the girl's soft blonde hair. Don't be scared. You're not alone here. Why are you crying? Did someone scare you? Who are you sorry for? The bunny? Suddenly, the girl pulled away from the toy and lifted her head. Her face had a big, silly smile, and it looked a little strange. It made Margaret feel uneasy. Her breath caught in her throat. The child spoke slowly. Her tone sounded deliberate. I'm sorry for you, you dumb old hag, for ending up stuck here where no one will ever think of you again. She started laughing loudly, pointing her finger at the woman on the floor nearby. The woman was moving around on the floor and laughing in a way that was not like a child. Margaret jumped to her feet and staggered back. Her heart was beating quickly as she moved closer to the man and woman, her fellow travelers in this strange situation. They stood there, mouths open, staring at the kid who was rolling around on the bench, laughing. This is weird, the man said, shaking his head. Hey, the plump woman shouted at the girl. Her voice was firm and commanding. Stop it immediately. Tell us where everyone went and where the bus is. But the girl just laughed even harder, flopping back onto the bench with a thud. White stuffing poked out of the rabbit's torn seams, mingled with odd red clumps of something unidentifiable. One of its glassy eyes dangled on a long, frayed thread, swinging back and forth, while the other seemed rolled up toward the ceiling. It looked like a dead, mangled toy. Margaret felt dizzy. Her head spun. She walked unsteadily to a bench and sat down. The hard wood creaked under her weight. She thought, I'm not going anywhere today. Her mind raced. This isn't like clocking in at a job. Marianne can survive without me. I'm done running myself ragged for her like some fool. If she won't move in with me, she can rot alone. She jumped up suddenly. She looked determined and started to walk to the exit. Lady, where are you going? The plump woman called out, rushing forward to try to block her path. The guy over there says we could call a taxi. I don't care. Margaret became angry. Her voice sounded sharp with frustration. I'm not in a hurry. I'm heading home. I don't know what's going on here. Sure thing, the girl said in a firm tone. Her eyes narrowed as she glared angrily at both women from under her eyebrows. Go ahead, you idiot. See you soon. I don't know what's wrong with that kid, Margaret said. Her voice shook as she held the heavy doorknob. But she's clearly out of it, really troubled. Who would let her go out alone like this? Does your phone work? The man called out from across the room where he was sitting on a bench. His briefcase was next to him. What? Margaret replied, startled, and dug her old flip phone Nokia out of her purse with shaky hands, flipping it open. Yeah, it works. Sorry to bother you, the man said, pausing for a moment as if embarrassed. But could I borrow it to make a call? Mine isn't working. I have to be in Groverton by 5. Someone is picking me up there to take me to the train station, and I'm stuck here with no way out. I just need to let them know or call a cab. No way, Margaret said angrily. She walked over and handed him the phone. Who are you going to call? Where are you going? She didn't like him at all. He was too good-looking, too young, and wearing a light blue dress shirt, a neatly knotted tie, and a ridiculous briefcase. She wondered what he was doing here, so far from the city. The man took the phone, dialed a number, and pressed it to his ear. He listened intently to the faint sounds on the other end before handing it back with a disappointed sigh. No dice. It's dead, he said. What? Margaret said, surprised, and grabbed it back, punching in Marianne's number with ease. At first, Margaret heard the ringing sound of a phone line, but it was quickly drowned out by a loud, unpleasant noise. Then, she heard a sharp crunch, followed by a strange noise that sounded like a mix of garbled music and static hissing through the speaker. Margaret had spent nearly her entire adult life in Ephraimville, a town she knew very well. She had left for a few years to study in the state capital, a busy city a few hours away. But even then, she came back every weekend to visit her parents. She couldn't stay away for long. The bus station was on the edge of town, so it was easy to get on the highway without having to drive through Ephraimville's small, potholed streets. From downtown where Margaret lived, you could catch the number 5 shuttle out here. It was the only shuttle route in town, despite its random number, looping through the same tired streets day after day. The bus station stop was the end of the line, and a couple of beat-up vans were usually there, waiting to be used again. On her walk to the stop, she didn't pass a single person. It was midweek, and the heat was unbearable. A dry wind kicked up dust, and this part of town was practically a ghost zone. As she got closer, she felt a cold dread start to overwhelm her. There were no vans waiting, no engines humming. Worse, the stop itself was gone. There was no trace of the old concrete shelter with its chipped paint and layers of graffiti scratched into the blocks. Margaret stood there, unable to do anything. She looked around, her eyes scanning the empty area around her. The road didn't end at the stop like it always had. It went on forever, disappearing into the hazy distance. Margaret knew that couldn't be right. She remembered that beyond this point, there should have been nothing but empty land and fields of dry grass. The interstate, Route 66, was miles off to the left, nowhere near here. But there it was, a road, clear as day, running left from town and right into the unknown, straight and unyielding, like it'd been drawn with a ruler. Where the stop sign used to be, there was a small roadside marker on a rusty metal pole. Its faded white letters spelled out Mile 321. Margaret recognized that sign. It was supposed to be on the highway to Groverton, not here. The sign was rusty and hot to the touch from the sun. Not a car had passed, not even a distant rumble. Suddenly, Margaret felt a deep, overwhelming loneliness wash over her. So intense it brought tears to her eyes. She felt like she was the only person in the world, left alone in that empty place. Okay, no shuttles. I'll just walk home, she decided, trying to shake off the panic. It was only a 20-minute walk from the station back to downtown Ephraimville. Not too bad, even if the heat was brutal and the wind was now whipping dust into her face. It was better than feeling stuck in this strange, unexplainable sadness. She started walking left, toward town. Her shoes made a crunching sound on the gravelly road. Then her phone buzzed in her bag, startling her. Someone's out there, she thought, her hands shaking as she reached for her phone and opened it. It was Nancy, her neighbor from across the hall. They weren't close, but they had exchanged a few words. "Nancy, Nancy," Margaret said into the phone. Her voice sounded tired and happy. "Yeah, hey," Nancy said. Her tone sounded flat and heavy, like she was carrying bad news. "What? What's wrong?" Margaret asked. Her words tumbled out fast. "Nothing," Nancy said after a pause. Her voice hesitated, and then she added, "I just wanted to say that everything's okay." "Okay? That's great," Margaret said. Her mood lightened a bit. "I'll be home soon. Can I swing by your place?" Nancy's voice faltered, tinged with confusion. "How? You couldn't make it," she said. "What couldn't you make?" Margaret asked. Her stomach tightened. "You didn't even show up for the funeral, let alone—" "What funeral?" Margaret interrupted. Her words sounded slow and deliberate, and her mind was racing as she tried to understand the situation. "What funeral?" Nancy's voice sounded shocked. "Are you okay? What's going on with you? Is it dementia? Forgetting everything?" "What dementia?" Margaret stammered. Her voice was barely above a whisper. She didn't understand, but she felt sure something was wrong. Whatever truth was coming, it was going to hit her hard, and she wouldn't like it one bit. "Nancy, I just wanted to tell you the wake went fine," Nancy interrupted. Her tone changed to be more matter-of-fact. "Me and Cole were there, and Samuel showed up. And on the third day, even a nice guy from her old job came by. Real polite fella. Everything went just like you wanted. Oh, and there's some of your money left over. I'll send it to you later." "Nancy." Margaret's jaw tightened. She felt a wave of dread wash over her. "Just tell me whose wake it was," she said. Her voice shook with panic. A faint, hesitant whisper came through the phone. "Margaret's, of course. Mary, don't freak me out. Did you really forget everything?" Margaret felt her world collapse. The sky turned a sickly, rusted yellow, thick and oppressive like boiling tar. She screamed. A deep, rough sound came out of her throat, and she kept screaming until she fell to the ground, holding her face while she sobbed. She cried for 5 solid minutes. Tears soaked into the dry earth, and then she suddenly stood up and ran. She had to get home to her apartment where she could collapse onto the couch, pull a blanket over her head, curl into a tight ball and stay there, hiding from everything forever. She ran clumsily. Her legs felt unsteady, and she tripped over rocks, struggling to catch her breath. Her heart pounded so loudly that she thought it would burst. She felt exhausted and very sad. Finally, she stopped by the mile 321 sign, staring blankly at the worn white numbers and the rusty metal pole. Her chest moved up and down quickly. She let out a heavy, shuddering sigh, then turned and walked back toward the station. Her tired feet dragged through the dust with every step. They were waiting on the benches when she returned. The man had taken off his tie and jacket. His shirt sleeves were rolled up. The woman sat beside him, hunched over. Her hands held her head, as if she were afraid it might split open from the pressure. Margaret slipped inside quietly, hoping that the station would feel normal again, like it had for the past few years of her trips. But that hope quickly faded when she stepped into the cold, stale air. Her companions noticed her when the door didn't shut loudly behind her. They turned their heads at the same time. The girl was back in her usual spot by the window, but instead of the rabbit, she now held a huge white teddy bear in her lap. Margaret recognized it right away. This reminded her of the blue rabbit from before. Their mom had given that bear to Marianne for one of her birthdays. A big, fluffy thing meant to cheer her up. And the rabbit? Their dad had brought it home from a work trip when they were kids. Margaret didn't say anything. She just crossed the room in silence and sat down on a bench behind the pair. The wood creaked under her weight. She didn't have the energy to speak. They stayed quiet too, watching her, waiting to see if she'd say anything, but she kept quiet. What could she possibly say? Her story wasn't a happy one. It wouldn't make them feel better. She was exhausted and didn't know what to say. Her legs hurt and buzzed from the walk. She was starting to breathe more evenly. Her temples hurt and she felt numb. She didn't even look at the kid, who sat there smiling wide and like she had won something. "I told you so," the girl said. Her voice was calm and matter-of-fact, and her steady gaze showed no malice. The plump woman asked, "So what's going on?" Her tone was desperate and pleading as she leaned forward slightly. Margaret paused. Her eyes moved from the woman's anxious, searching stare to the man's wide, frightened one. She breathed out slowly, shrugged her shoulders, and looked out the window, avoiding the smug little figure in pink. "I thought you might need some help, so I came back," she said flatly. Her voice sounded bored. The woman suggested, "Can we call a cab or something?" Her voice cracked as tears welled up in her eyes. "I'm so tired. I can't take this anymore." "It's her," she said, pointing to the girl. "She's the one saying all that crazy stuff." The man agreed. His lips formed a grim, humorless smile. "Any other day, I'd never believe a kid could say stuff like that. It sounds like something out of a horror movie. We were even thinking about running away to the city." The woman looked at him. Her tired eyes brightened as she listened to him. "Then you came back in. You were gone for like 10 minutes, tops. I guess you didn't get very far before you changed your mind." 10 minutes, Margaret repeated. Her voice sounded empty as she realized what had happened. She didn't finish her thought. She glanced at her watch. 2:33. No way that's right, she thought. Her mind raced. The bus had left at 2:30, and then she'd talked to that strange kid, had that weird call with Nancy, and wandered around the missing stop, all in just 10 minutes? "So what about it?" the woman interrupted her, cutting her off. Her tone sounded desperate and firm. "What about a taxi? Your phone works, right? Can we order one? We'll pay whatever it takes. Whatever you say is fair." Margaret turned her head away and stared blankly at the wall. "She's lying!" the girl suddenly screamed. Her voice sounded shrill and piercing. "Lying! You threw it, didn't you?" She jumped up from her seat, took 2 quick steps forward, and loomed over Margaret, who flinched back in alarm. The girl's glare looked dark and threatening. Margaret felt her mouth go dry. Her heart pounded as she forced out, "Through what? What are you talking about?" She stood up quickly and tried to hit the girl, but the girl moved quickly and evaded her. Her footsteps echoed as she shrieked at the top of her lungs. "Help! Murder! She's killing me! My mom's gonna kill me! They killed me! Devils killed me!" In any other situation, it might have looked comical, like a child throwing a wild tantrum. But here and now, it was downright terrifying. The man jumped up, grabbed Margaret from behind, and hugged her tightly. He held her still for a few seconds while the woman ran to calm the shaking, screaming girl. The man let go and pointed Margaret to the empty spot on the bench beside him. His face showed he was serious but not unkind. "I believe you," he said firmly, then glanced at the plump woman for a moment before adding, "We both believe you. That little monster over there isn't going to tell us the truth. Just tell us what's going on out there. Or better yet, can we crash at your place for a couple of hours? I need to regroup somewhere. And I was thinking of calling my friends in Groverton to pick me up. I'll pay you for the trouble, whatever you want." He started to look through his briefcase, but Margaret stopped him. She pressed her hand firmly against his arm and spoke in a low, serious tone. "If I could get out of here, I'd have left a long time ago. We can't. It's not an option." They looked at each other for a few tense seconds. They silently understood each other. Then he quickly pulled his hand away, stood up, and threw his briefcase across the room at the girl, who was sitting by the window like usual. She still had that annoying smile on her face. The two women watched, stunned, as the briefcase sailed through the air and then, impossibly, hovered right in front of the girl's face. It stayed there for a few eerie seconds before dropping softly to the floor with a dull thud. Like nothing had happened. The three of them went outside together. The hot, dusty air hit them like a wall as they stood there, breathing it in deeply and looking around at the empty space around them. The sun remained motionless in the sky, The day dragged on without end. Margaret checked her watch again. It was still 3:07. She stared at the tiny second hand, counting as it ticked through 10 slow loops before the minute hand finally, reluctantly, shifted forward by 1 notch. It felt like time was moving very slowly. At first, everyone stood in heavy silence, each grappling with the weight of their thoughts, unsure how to put the unspeakable into words. The man, whose name was Steve, spoke up first. His voice sounded low and rough. "I never thought it would end like this," he said. "Like what?" Vera asked. Her voice shook a little as she turned to him. "Dead," Steve replied softly. His eyes were looking at the ground. "And don't look at me like that. I can't stand sugarcoating things." "I don't want to die," Vera said in a weak voice. Her hands were clenched and she was nervous. "I'm only 33. I'm too young for this." "Why are you so sure we'll—" Margaret started, then faltered. The word die caught in her throat. Steve looked at her, his face showing disdain. "Have you ever heard of this happening to someone you know? Or have you gone through it yourself?" Margaret thought for a moment, then whispered, "No, never." "Exactly," he said with a nod. "People who get caught up in stuff like this, they never come back. They're just gone." "I need to use the bathroom," Vera suddenly said. Her voice sounded shaky and urgent. "I'll be quick, I promise. I'm going around back. I can't stand looking at her." She hurried off along the side of the station. The gravel crunched as she walked. "Stephen?" Margaret asked quietly. Her voice was barely audible. "Is this just random? Our time is up and that's it?" He gave her a faint, tired smile. "Who knows? It could be God's plan or just a coincidence, depending on what you believe." "I never believed in anything," Margaret admitted softly. Her eyes looked distant as she added, "Right now, I don't understand anything." They stood there for a while. The silence stretched out again. "Where's Vera? We should stick together." "Vera! Vera! I'll go check on her," Margaret said, trying to sound calm. She started walking towards the corner where Vera had last been seen. Around the corner, half buried in a mix of dust and sand, lay a skeleton. Its bones looked stark white against the gritty earth. Margaret knew it was Vera's the moment she saw the tattered scraps of fabric fluttering in the wind. The fabric was emerald and pink, the exact colors of that sundress she'd noticed right away when they'd first crossed paths inside. She crouched down next to the skull. One side of the skull was already covered by the moving sand. One empty eye socket stared up at her, the other quickly covered by the hot, fiery wind and sand. In a short time, a small dune had formed, completely covering what was left of the woman. Margaret stood up slowly and made her way back to the station entrance. She walked slowly, as if each step was difficult for her. Steve wasn't there anymore. She went into the building, but the waiting area was empty. His briefcase sat on a bench, his jacket slung over the backrest. Both looked worn and tattered, like they had been sitting there for months, gathering dust. The wind blew in, carrying sand through the cracks in the walls and the holes that had formed in the aging structure. The station was falling apart quickly. The concrete walls and ceiling were crumbling, and bits of rebar were showing. They were rusted and creaked. The wind was constantly blowing sand into the station, and it was getting worse. The girl sat in her usual spot by the window, unfazed, but she wasn't holding a toy anymore. She was holding a piece of paper. Margaret looked at her. She wanted to ask if she had seen Steve, but she couldn't form the words. "He's gone too, isn't he?" she said. She looked down at the floor, watching as sand piled up around her black shoes, slowly swallowing them. "It's time for us too," the girl said with a light, chilling laugh. "Wait, wait, I can't, I don't want to, I don't want to, I don't want to," Margaret cried out, Her voice broke as she ran to the door, but a huge sand dune blocked her path, stretching up to the ceiling and trapping her. There was no way out. She felt the girl's small, warm hand slip into hers, gripping it tightly. "Where?" she asked, trying to find a way out. Margaret spoke quietly. Her voice shook. "There," the girl replied simply, pulling her toward the restroom, the one corner that hadn't been covered by the sand. Margaret followed. Her heart was beating very fast, and her mind was telling her not to be scared. "Don't be scared," the girl said, her voice suddenly filled with a giggle. Her tone shifted to something soft and tender, almost comforting. "I'm here with you." "What's your name?" Margaret asked quietly. "I don't know," the girl replied quietly. Her voice sounded gentle. "You never gave me one, did you?" She held out the paper she had been holding, offering it to Margaret. Margaret took a look at it and immediately understood. It was an ultrasound scan, showing a faint outline of a life that never was. The paper slipped from the girl's fingers, and in an instant, a gust of wind buried it under a thin layer of sand. They stepped into the small bathroom together. The air felt heavy and still. The girl gently turned Margaret to face the mirror, which was cracked. Then she wrapped her small arms around Margaret's stomach and pressed her face against it. She rubbed her warm, soft hand against Margaret's stomach and whispered, "Don't be scared. Don't be scared, Mommy. I'm right here with you. We'll be together now forever." Margaret lifted her head slowly. Her eyes met her own reflection. The light bulb above her flickered on without being touched. Its weak light spilled into the mirror's surface. The glass seemed to absorb the light. Then it flared brightly, transforming into a rectangular portal. The portal was blinding, milky white, like an open door to somewhere beyond. "Ready, daughter?" Margaret said. She smiled faintly as she looked down at the girl. "Let's go." With her hand in hers, they took a step forward into the amazing, mysterious light, and they disappeared into it. Nick was sitting on the ground by the road. His shoulders shook as he quietly cried. He used his shaking hands to cover his face and stop himself from making noise. Below him, his Greyhound bus lay on its side in the shallow ditch. Its metal frame looked bent and still. Nearby, a small group of people stood together. They were speaking loudly and quickly. A gentle hand touched Nick's shoulder. It was warm and steady. He looked up, blinking through tears, and saw a woman standing over him. Her expression looked soft but firm. "Nick, you don't need to blame yourself," she said quietly. Her voice made him stop feeling guilty. "I can't help it," he said, his voice cracking. His voice almost became a shout. "It's my fault. I told them over and over that the brakes were broken, barely working. I should have put my foot down, slammed my fist on the table, refused to take it out. But they..." The woman patted his shoulder again, trying to comfort him. "You saved us," she said, nodding toward the road. Nick followed her gaze. His eyes landed on a beat-up sedan parked nearby. It was the same car he had narrowly avoided crashing into when the brakes suddenly stopped working. A young man in a suit and tie was standing by it. He looked shaken but alive. He had a scared 10-year-old girl in a pink dress and white sandals clinging tightly to his side. "Saved," Nick whispered to himself. His voice cracked as he added, "But I killed 3 others." He tried not to look at the 3 long shapes lying near the wrecked bus, covered in dusty gray tarps, but his eyes kept drifting there. Under one of the tarps, a piece of green and pink fabric fluttered in the wind. "It's not your fault," a woman said. Her tone sounded regretful. "We're alive thanks to you. We hit like a freight train and we could have all been killed. But we're here. Me, my Steve, and our little Maggie. We'll be forever grateful." She squeezed his shoulder one last time and then walked back to her family, her loved ones, who were safe and breathing thanks to him.